As someone whose introduction to the world of comics came at the turn of the 21st century, one of the books that truly made me fall in love with superheroes was Ultimate Spider-Man. Brought to life by the team of Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley, this contemporary reimagining of Peter Parker's early years is a series that holds a special place in my heart, not only being the first title that I would read each month, but also being my gateway into discovering so many iconic Marvel heroes and villains. I've covered a lot of different Ultimate Marvel comics during this channel's lifespan, however few mean more to me personally than Ultimate Spider-Man, and when deciding which specific chapter of this 160 issue saga I wanted to cover first, there were honestly no shortage of possible options. There are so many fantastic storylines throughout this run that exemplify just what makes Ultimate Spider-Man such a terrific series, but I think to best articulate just why it's so great, I want to highlight how Ultimate Spider-Man reimagined one of the most divisive Marvel storylines of all time, turning it from a black mark on the hero's long-standing mythos to one of the very best storylines in the entire Ultimate Spider-Man run, with that story being the Clone Saga. Originally published between 1994 and 1996, this storyline remains one of the most polarising status quo changes in the entire history of The Amazing Spider-Man, and one that in many ways exemplifies what happens when the DNA of a beloved character is drastically changed with little foresight or long-term planning. In the 2.5 decades since it was first told, the Clone Saga has garnered a legacy as one of the most controversial comic book storylines of all time, and yet throughout the end of 2006 and 2007, Bendis and Bagley sought to bring a brand new version of this story to life, and against all odds, turn it into one of the most fondly remembered parts of their seminal run on Ultimate Spider-Man. And so in this video, I want to explain the history of just how the Ultimate Clone Saga came to be, discuss the history of both Ultimate Spider-Man up to this point, and why the original Clone Saga had become such a divisive and polarising storyline, and explain how the team of Bendis and Bagley reworked this flawed and failed concept and transformed it into one of the most memorable Spider-Man stories of a generation. Before we continue though, just a quick reminder to leave a like on this video if you enjoy it, and subscribe to Owen Likes Comics so you don't miss out on any future videos. As the clock struck midnight on the 31st of December 1999, a new millennium was ushered in across the world. For many, this was an opportunity to change, to enter a new era, and for Marvel Comics this was especially the case. You see, throughout much of the late 1990s, Marvel had faced major financial problems, filing for bankruptcy in late 1996, and even once they emerged from it, they were still forced to find ways to remain afloat. A far cry from the billion-dollar movie machine we know them as today, Marvel in the year 2000 was a company desperately looking for a way to revitalise interest in their line of comics, and because of this, two figures who had recently rose to prominence within the company pitched an idea that would eventually change everything. The first of these two individuals was Bill Jemas, the newly appointed president, who as one of his first acts proposed a Ground Zero relaunch, scrapping Marvel's entire comic book universe and starting from the very beginning again. Alongside Jemas was Marvel's new editor-in-chief Joe Quesada, a longtime comic artist who had been promoted following his success overseeing the Marvel Knights imprint. Quesada, intrigued by Jemas's idea, proposed that this Ground Zero initiative would actually become its own separate imprint, where the company could reimagine many of their most popular heroes while still maintaining the continuity of their long-running series. Jemas agreed, and with this new plan now devised, it was quickly decided that Spider-Man, the company's biggest character, would serve as the launching pad for this new line of books, with the duo searching for a writer to create this brand new iteration of the hero. The writer they eventually chose was Brian Michael Bendis, who at this time was largely known for his work on the Spawn spin-off comic Sam and Twitch, as well as his independent comic Jinx. Given free rein to reinterpret Spider-Man however he saw fit, Bendis, alongside longtime Spider-Man artist Mark Bagley, reimagined the wall crawler through a retelling of his origin story, adapting the original 11-page story from Amazing Fantasy 15 into a massive 6-issue saga that would by the end of it throw readers launches into the thick of both this new iteration of Peter Parker and the brand new universe that he lived in. Upon the release of its first issue in September of 2000, Ultimate Spider-Man quickly became a monumental success, inspiring not only the creation of many more Ultimate titles, but giving Bendis and Bagley both the freedom and the opportunity to continue telling the story of this new version of Spider-Man. As such, over the next 6 years, the duo would turn Ultimate Spider-Man from an ambitious new idea to a staple of modern comics, becoming one of the regular best-selling books every month and a must-read for any die-hard fans of the web-slinger. In addition to this, the comic would also prove to be a great jumping-on point for new readers, especially in the aftermath of Sam Raimi's acclaimed 2002 Spider-Man film. Throughout their run on the series, Bendis and Bagley would adapt and recontextualize many classic Spidey stories, including but not limited to the Black Suit Saga and the emergence of Venom, the creation of the Sinister Six, and the deaths of both Gwen Stacy and Jean DeWolf. As a result, by the time that the book's 100th issue was approaching, Bendis and Bagley sought to launch another big story arc to celebrate this occasion. One that would not only underline the significance of this milestone, but also pave the way for the future direction that Ultimate Spider-Man would take for the next several years. The story they chose, to the surprise of almost everyone, was the highly controversial 90s story arc, The Clone Saga. As you're likely already aware, The Clone Saga is a story that has a deeply polarising legacy within Marvel Comics. For fans who remember reading it as it unfolded throughout the mid-1990s, the prospect of Ultimate Spider-Man, a comic that had been almost consistently met with acclaim and praise, adapting it seemed like an impossible and unenviable task. One of the fans who read The Clone Saga at this time is Sal, host of the YouTube channel ComicPop, and so I want to hand the video over to him so he can explain the history behind the Spider-Man Clone Saga, how the original story came to be, and why in the years since it's garnered such a divisive reputation, as well as his thoughts and expectations when he learned that the story was going to be adapted into the pages of Ultimate Spider-Man.
Thank you, Owen. I'm Sal from the YouTube channel ComicPop, and The Clone Saga literally drove me out of comics for at least 5 years. Now, the original Clone Saga I was not around for, which is 1975, which we now call Clone Genesis. It all culminates in Amazing Spider-Man number 149, in which the Jackal, a Spider-Man villain who was also, at that time, his college professor, instigates a battle between Spider-Man and the clone, who we would now know as Ben Reilly. And afterwards, a battle ensues. The clone is destroyed or seemingly dead. Spider-Man throws his body down a smokestack, and then we don't see or hear anything about clones until 1981's What If number 30, in which they muse about the idea, what if the spider clone had survived? What if the spider clone had survived? Wouldn't that be a funny reality we live in? And it's a one-shot, and it's silly, and it's played for laughs, and that's where it should have stayed. But then, in 1994, they start peppering in these little appearances, these faceless cameos, in which they're indicating that there's an unseen character returning from the past, and it all comes together in Web of Spider-Man number 117, a full 19 years since the clone's last appearance, or 5 years if you're reading the comic books. This revelation will lead to 2 years worth of sprawling stories that have no direction or proper resolution, involving more clones, revelations, deaths, angels, cults, and Mary Jane's pregnancy. So we can blame a lot of people for the Clone Saga, but the main culprit, I think, is the death of Superman and Nightfall for catching the attention of the higher-ups at Marvel, who are like, we need a Nightfall for Spider-Man. We need a sales juggernaut that will help to revitalize the line and get us some money. And so the directive comes down, get us a Death of Superman, a Nightfall, some kind of massive sprawling epic, something big that'll shake up the line and get us some money. And so the writers bandy about ideas, and there's a lot of speculation about who came up with the actual idea to bring the clone back. I've heard J.M. DeMatteis' name used, but regardless of who initially came up with it, the concept is bring back the clone. And this sparked an idea that has been in the works since 1987 when Spider-Man married Mary Jane, which is, we could use this to unmake the marriage. That's right, a full 10 years before One More Day would come, they were still complaining about the Spider-Man marriage, and they were thinking, maybe we could use this as a way of bringing Peter Parker back to his roots, get those Archie love triangles going, and undo this marriage. Now, I think that concept, the idea of just bringing back the clone in general, ended up opening up a Pandora's box of bad ideas, resulting in story diversions and tangents, and characters like Judas Traveler, who is limitlessly powerful, or actually a charlatan, maybe he's an angel, or maybe he's a mutant, or maybe nothing. Now, it didn't help that an impending bankruptcy at Marvel of 1996, the multiple editors-in-chief at the time, that's right, multiple editors-in-chief, causing further bureaucracy to gum up the works, no clear story direction, no plans for a resolution, and a desperate chasing of sales, all resulted in mutating this original story into this epic that wouldn't stop and kept transforming, and we're just getting bigger and uglier and more problematic. Now, if you ask me how I feel about the Clone Saga, you'd probably guess, and how I inevitably ended up feeling about the Clone Saga. But I will admit that initially, when it first started, I was pretty much on board, because I took them at their word. And I had already been on admittedly a couple of bumpy rides for Spider-Man. Inevitably, after probably about 6 months to a year, I was getting fatigued, tired, and exhausted, until the culmination point where I just had enough. And the reason I had enough was because they dropped this bomb. And the bomb, of course, was that Ben Reilly, the clone, who had returned after 19 years, was actually the real Spider-Man. And that the Spider-Man that I grew up on, the Spider-Man that I was introduced to in the comics, was a clone. That broke me. To say that the stories you were reading were being led by an imposter protagonist was just too much for me. And it didn't help that the recent stories that had led up to it involved the Jackal acting like a Jim Carrey clone, running around laughing and indicating that there is going to be more revelations and more surprises, more twists. I had enough. So I got off, and I kept an ear to the ground because I was reading a periodical at the time that kind of covered comic books. So I kept an eye out for what was going on, basically just waiting for it to be over. Now, when I heard that Bendis was going to adapt the Clone Saga in Ultimate Spider-Man, I thought that was a hilarious joke that eventually led to concern on my behalf. I thought, what hubris. You know, nobody asked for the Clone Saga. The Clone Saga came from a creatively bankrupt place. Why would you do it when you have total creative freedom to do whatever you want? As the story was rolling forward, I found myself being more and more invested, and at the end of it, I'm like, you nailed it. You accomplished what few could do. You told the Clone Saga your own way, with a clear direction, and you pulled it off in a very short amount of time. And I loved it. And in fact, I took my Clone Saga trade to a New York Comic-Con, and I brought it to Bendis, and I said to him, this is when I knew I'd never stop reading Ultimate Spider-Man. If you could pull off the Clone Saga, then you can do anything. So I have a real affinity for the Ultimate Clone Saga. I think it really nails it. I think it pays homage to what came before in a very genuine way, not just in a tongue-in-cheek, oh, this is this character, this is this character, this is this plot point, this is this joke. No, in an organic way that told the story, but stayed true to the universe it was in. In the end, the Clone Saga is both a relic and a touchstone. I think it's worthy of preservation, and most importantly, observation and excavation. It's important to know where it came from, what to learn from it, and what to do and what not to do. But there are a few things from the Clone Saga that have not only remained, but endured. You got Ben Reilly, you got Mayday Parker, you've got the resurrection of Norman Osborn. There is a lot from that still informs the stories today, and actually has a light in a lot of comic book readers' hearts. So while I was quick to dismiss it as a kid, as an adult, I can look back on it, and while I do recognize that it did literally push me out of the comic book industry for a good long time, I'm indebted to those years where I was able to try new things, read new stuff, and experience life outside of the comic book industry, and then allow myself to re-immerse myself again and find a new love for it. Because when I got back into comic books after the Clone Saga, you know what pulled me back in? It was Spider-Man. 2 Spider-Men. Straczynski Spider-Man, and Ultimate Spider-Man, which of course would lead to the Ultimate Clone Saga. So, in many ways, I owe the Clone Saga.
Despite any and all concerns many fans had towards the idea of the Clone Saga being adapted, the story proved to be a tremendous success, becoming one of the standout arcs of the entire Ultimate Spider-Man series. While the saga would take place throughout late 2006 and early 2007, the building blocks of this storyline can actually be traced back to several years earlier. In particular, much of the setup for the Ultimate Clone Saga can be found in the 11th volume of Ultimate Spider-Man entitled Carnage. Now, this story told throughout Ultimate Spider-Man issues 60 through 65 see Dr. Kirk Connors and his assistant Ben Reilly use a DNA sample of Peter Parker to create the Carnage symbiote, which eventually breaks free of its containment and rampages throughout New York City, eventually killing Gwen Stacy. The comic's resolution sees Peter, shaken by the loss of Gwen, overcome and defeat the Carnage symbiote, with Dr. Connors turning himself into the police for creating this monster. However, the end of Ultimate Spider-Man issue 65 would see Ben Reilly steal the remaining DNA samples of Peter Parker, planning to continue this research and setting in motion the impending arrival of the clones. The Clone Saga would then officially begin in Ultimate Spider-Man issue 97. This comic opens with Peter Parker and Mary Jane eating lunch together in a mall, with the pair trying to remain friends after their recent breakup. This is interrupted though by the arrival of the Scorpion, a new villain wreaking havoc and attacking civilians throughout the mall. As the police struggle to detain the villain, Peter takes MJ to safety and suits up, and it's during this fight that a strange development begins to unfold, as Scorpion's mask is damaged in the battle, revealing underneath none other than the face of Peter Parker. After defeating Scorpion, Peter takes the villain to the Fantastic Four, who confirm that the Scorpion is an almost perfect match of the hero's DNA. Meanwhile, as Mary Jane returns home, she's suddenly kidnapped by a mysterious figure, later revealed to be a clone of Peter named Kane. Kane holds MJ hostage and injects her with Norman Osborn's Oz formula. After returning home, Peter quickly discovers that Mary Jane is missing, and upon searching for her, instead finds a now alive Gwen Stacy in her place. Shocked at how Gwen is somehow alive, the pair embrace as Peter attempts to explain her revival to Aunt May, and in the process revealing his secret identity. This bombshell is interrupted by a sudden knock on the door, and the chaos is amplified when not only does Richard Parker, Peter's long-lost father, arrive, but so does Nick Fury with an army of Spider Slayers. Fury orders Gwen and the Parkers to all surrender, and as Peter does, Gwen reveals her true form and transforms into Carnage, attacking the Spider Slayers and causing Aunt May to suffer a heart attack. Richard tends to May as Peter confronts Fury, before he's interrupted by the Fantastic Four. Reed attempts to convince Fury to relent. However, as the pair argue, Peter is rescued by a mysterious spider person, who reveals herself to be Jessica Drew. After taking Peter to safety, Jessica explains that she's a female clone of him created by Ben Reilly, and that several clones were created from Peter's DNA, including both Kane and the Scorpion. Jessica tells Peter that she believes Kane has kidnapped Mary Jane, and the pair search for them inside Oscorp, eventually discovering that MJ is transformed into a monstrous goblin-like creature, attacking both Kane and another clone wearing a black costume. Peter is eventually able to reason with MJ though and convince her to depower, as she collapses to the floor. While Peter checks on her though, the room is suddenly swarmed by Spider Slayers, led by both Fury and, perhaps most surprisingly, Dr. Otto Octavius. Fury attempts to apprehend Peter and the clones. However, Otto reveals that the clones belong to him, and that he oversaw the program that created them while secretly working for the FBI. The clones refuse to go back with Octavius, and a fight breaks out between all of these different forces, with Kane being shot and killed by a Spider Slayer before Peter and Jessica are able to nullify and defeat Octavius. S.H.I.E.L.D. arrest Otto whilst Jessica flees. However, before they can apprehend Peter, the Human Torch arrives and takes him to the Baxter Building, where we learn that not only was Richard Parker another clone of Peter, this one rapidly aging, but also that Reed has cured Mary Jane of the Oz serum, and even offers to do the same for him. Peter ultimately refuses though, and instead we see him and MJ return home with Aunt May as the trio attempt to rebuild their relationships and come to terms with everything that has unfolded. Whilst May gives Peter her blessing to continue on as Spider-Man, he and MJ profess their love to one another, deciding to give their relationship another try, with Peter finally accepting his place as both the friendly neighbourhood superhero and the one and only Peter Parker. In my opinion, the Clone Saga is one of the greatest successes of the entire Ultimate Spider-Man run. Throughout this 9-issue story, the team of Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley managed to deconstruct and rebuild this deeply divisive storyline and turn it into a fascinating case study about just what it means to be Spider-Man, as well as the true face of the person behind the mask. For all of its cameos, characters and sudden plot twists, the Ultimate Clone Saga never forgets its core focus, with almost every single aspect of this story remaining centred around Peter Parker and his battle for identity. The notion of duality has long been a core component in Spider-Man's stories, with the war between the life that Peter wants to lead and his responsibility as a superhero informing so many of the character's best stories. And although it was by no means a new concept by the mid-2000s, I think this story's use of the clones, as well as Peter's relationship with them, demonstrates this duality in a really interesting way. In particular, the comic focuses primarily on 3 of the clones, Kane, the Scorpion and Jessica Drew, and I think all of them are interesting parallels to Peter Parker. For example, Kane in this story very much represents Peter without his strong moral compass, still seeking to protect those who he cares about, but doing so in a deeply reckless and dangerous way, which ultimately proves to be his undoing. Likewise, the Scorpion symbolises Peter without his humanity, retaining all of the hero's extraordinary power, but without the compassion that guides him and makes him a hero. And perhaps the most interesting of these characters is Jessica Drew. Now, this interpretation of Spider-Woman is drastically different to how she's traditionally characterised in Earth 616, with this version not only being a clone of Peter Parker, but also being written as transgender, with her arc in the Clone Saga being one of self-discovery, teaming up with Peter to find MJ and save the day from Dr. Octopus, and eventually going off to start a new life and find her own identity. For Peter though, the Ultimate Clone Saga is a story that reaffirms his heroism and significance within the Ultimate Marvel universe. By contrasting him to both Kane and the Scorpion, 2 clones of him that have the same great power but use it in dangerous ways, it reminds us that what makes Spider-Man such a tremendous hero isn't his extraordinary abilities, but the incredible person that he is even without them. And it's this humanity and morality that not only allows Peter to save the day, but cements him as the one true Spider-Man. Whereas the 90s Clone Saga was a confusing and meandering story, Bendis and Bagley's version sets out this theme from the very beginning, and throughout its 9-issue arc, manages to resolve the clone story while simultaneously advancing Peter's journey in the way that the original tried and failed to for several years. By the time the Ultimate Clone Saga concludes, Peter's relationships with both Mary Jane and Aunt May have significantly changed, with his on and off relationship with the former now fortified by their shared experiences, and his secret identity now out in the open and accepted by the woman who raised him. These status quo changes would guide the remaining issues of Ultimate Spider-Man, as following the Clone Saga, the series would continue for another 55 issues, eventually concluding in August of 2011, with the tragic death of Peter Parker and the introduction of Miles Morales. For me personally, the Ultimate Clone Saga is nothing short of a major triumph. The fact that Bendis and Bagley even attempted to adapt this story at all is admirable, never mind the fact that they were able to turn it from a major missed opportunity into one of the most fondly remembered parts of the entire Ultimate Spider-Man series. I've long believed that within the original 90s Clone Saga lies an actually interesting story, one that was sadly lost in the midst of many different creative voices fighting to be heard and editorial mandates, and yet it's here in Bendis and Bagley's 9-issue story that this untapped potential is finally realised. The Ultimate Clone Saga is a milestone story for so many reasons, serving as the 100-issue celebration of Ultimate Spider-Man and the series' most ambitious story yet, the crowning achievement and culmination of Bendis and Bagley's long-running partnership, and the ultimate redemption arc for one of comics' most polarising storylines. It's all of these factors and more that make the Ultimate Clone Saga such an honest success story, as it somehow fixed and redeemed one of comics' most polarising stories and gave longtime Spider-Man fans the version of the Clone Saga that they had always deserved. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to leave a like on this video and leave a comment down below as well. Let me know your thoughts on everything we talked about in today's video. I can't wait to hear what you have to say as always. If you're new to Owen Likes Comics, please make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notify bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. And if you enjoyed this and you want some more, there should be some other videos on screen right now that you might also enjoy. I want to give a big special thanks to Sal from ComicPop for coming on and helping me with this video. I will leave links to Sal's channel and his socials in the description, so please do head on over to ComicPop and keep up to date with everything they're working on. If you want some more of me, you can follow me on Twitter just at Owen Likes Comics, and if you want to help support the channel and help me make more videos, you can do so over at patreon.com/OwenLikesComics. But that's all for this video though. Again, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I'll see you next time. But until then, take care and keep reading.